So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's ILC UK webinar. My name is Paul Gould, and I'm the Head of Partnerships here at ILC UK. And this afternoon, we're going to be looking at retirement pension planning with our partners, LV. Here at ILC, we work very closely with those companies and organisations on our partners programme to help us open up the debate on getting the most from longevity and on developing those solutions that help us to live longer, healthier, and more fulfilling lives. So we're delighted to be able to welcome Kate Morris from LV to talk about their findings from their Wealth and Wellbeing survey, and in particular their findings on retirement planning decisions. I'm also delighted to welcome Sir Steve Webb, former Pensions Minister and partner at Lane, Clark and Peacock, to comment on the findings and their implications. And also two ILC colleagues, Arunima Himawan, Senior Health Research Lead, and Dr. Vivian Burrows, Senior Research Fellow, to get their thoughts as well. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and will be available after the event on our website and on our YouTube channel. So, saving for retirement across our working life is a key part of ensuring a financially secure later life, but all too often we only find out the consequences of those decisions, or the lack of them, when it's far too late. So what we've been discussing with LV is what can we learn from those who are actually living through their retirement and their pensions, and actually living with those consequences. What are the implications of cost of living crisis on the attitudes to retirement, pensions and savings, and how have they changed over recent years? So to explore this issue, Kate will be outlining the contents of their Wealth and Wellbeing survey, and then we'll go through the findings in particular on their work on retirement planning. I will then invite Steve, Aaron and Vivian to give their reflections on the data in the presentation, and in particular any implications for future and policy and practice. We'll then have a Q&A session, and please do ask your questions throughout the webinar using the Q&A function. So that's all from me, and without further ado, I'd like to pass across to Kate from LV for her presentation of the findings. Kate, over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, Paul, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar. As Paul said, I'm Kate Morris, the Senior Insight Manager at LV, and today I'm going to share some insights on consumers' views of retirement planning from the perspective of those who've already retired, which is actually taken from edition 12 of our LV Wealth and Wellbeing Research Programme. I just wanted to start by giving you a bit of background on our programme. It was launched during the COVID pandemic in June 2020 and has run every quarter since then, allowing us to track the UK's personal finances and explore people's behaviours around wealth and wellbeing. We've been able to follow a unique period of market turmoil and change over these past 3 years. It's important for us to understand how consumers think, feel and behave around their finances so we can ensure the best outcome for customers. We survey 4,000 nationally representative UK adults each quarter and ask tracking questions covering saving, spending, financial situation, well-being and worries. We ask 35 questions every quarter, which allows us to track over time and also drill down into specific areas. We also revisit certain themes on an annual basis to see if consumer views are changing. The programme gives us the opportunity each quarter to deep dive into topics of interest. And we discussed today's topic with our ILC partners and ran the bespoke questions in March 2023 on the age at which people retired, whether retirement was as planned, their reasons for retirement, and engagement with retirement planning activities. We create and publish a quarterly report sharing the reality of what is happening to consumer finances with an unbiased approach. And we want to make sure our insights are publicly available, so we share the knowledge gained around these consumer current financial situation with others, including advisors, industry stakeholders and third-party organisations, and hope by highlighting these issues that we can support and help drive forward positive change as a result. You can find out more on our dedicated Wealth and Wellbeing page on lv.com. I wanted to start by sharing the latest view, which was surveyed in June this year, of our 8 main indices. We track these each quarter, and the charts show trends over the past 3 years, covering key areas of income, outgoings, and savings behaviour. Each index is based on the percentage who stated a positive change over the past 3 months, for example, an increase or things getting better, first, and subtracting the percentage of people who stated a negative change over the same 3 months, so those who reported a decrease or things worsening. This works out the overall impact. The chart on the bottom left shows that the consumers have reported a steep rise in outgoings from March 2021 onwards. And on the bottom right, you can see that the supermarket spend index shows a similar rise alongside the socializing spend index, which has remained negative since September 2021, meaning more people are spending less versus those spending more in this area as discretionary spend comes under pressure. We also look at whether consumers feel their current situation has improved or worsened in the past 3 months and their outlook for their finances for the next 3 months, and this is shown on the top left. Whilst we have seen some improvement in these indices since the low in September 2022, both remain negative, reflecting that in June more people said their finances had worsened in the past 3 months than those reporting an improvement. And on outlook, more people are expecting things to get worse in the following 3 months than improve. The LV Wellbeing Tracker takes this further by looking at the net of those reporting their current financial situation as comfortable and those reporting themselves as struggling each quarter. And it is shown here tracking against some of the key events we've seen in the past 3 years. Throughout the pandemic, the tracker was around 37. Then, as restrictions were lifted, consumer finances improved, with the tracker hitting 45 in June 2021. However, with interest rates beginning to rise and more consumers found themselves financially struggling, this is reflected in the sharp decline in the wellness tracker in March 2022. This decline continued throughout 2022, with increasing inflation putting real pressure on consumer finances. And by the end of the year, the wellness measure was at a low of 15. The latest results shared in our third year anniversary report saw a slight improvement to plus 17 from the low earlier this year. But overall, we see sentiment around personal finances lower now than at any time during the pandemic, reflecting the difficult economic conditions. We've completed regression analysis on some of our measures to look at how correlated they are with key economic metrics. This analysis looked for correlations between the data sets to see how closely aligned the data trends are. For example, as one data set shows a decrease, does the other also decrease? And also any inverse relationships. We have found strong relationships between the ONS Consumer Price Index, including housing, the CPIH, with our outgoings index, and also with a tracking question we ask people about money worries. Both our measures have followed the increase seen in the CPIH figures as people report rising costs and increased worries about their personal financial situation. Our savings index data was also aligned with the ONS household savings ratio when we tested this last year. We will be repeating this analysis shortly to see if this relationship still exists based on the most recently updated ONS data. These findings increase our confidence that our data accurately reflects consumers' responses to the current economic environment. Now we will move on to some bespoke questions we asked to explore retirement planning from the perspective of existing retirees. A key area of interest was the age at which people retired. And from the survey, we found that 35% of current retirees have retired before they turned 60, with a further 38% retiring before the age of 65, leaving 28% saying they retired post 65. A consumer group we regularly track are mass affluent people, those with assets of between 100,000 and 500,000, excluding property. Here we saw that a slightly higher percentage of retired mass affluent people retire before they turn 60 than we see in the overall population. Almost double the amount of homeowners retired before the age of 60 compared to those who are renters, 37% versus 19%. And looking at results by gender, we found that men were more likely to retire before the age of 60 than women. Our research over the past few years has frequently highlighted that women have lower pension savings than men, potentially explaining why more men were able to retire under the age of 60. We found women often have less money to save during their working lives due to reduced working hours when they have children, or through earning less on average due to the gender pay gap. A previous quarter of Wealth and Wellbeing research found that women are less confident with their finances, so they may also be less aware of how important it is to save into their pension. Having lower or no pension savings means many women are having to delay their retirement until they receive their state pension. Alongside information about the age at which people retired, we were curious to see if retirement plans went as people expected them to. The majority, or 57% of current retirees, retired at the time they expected to, with the rest retiring earlier or later than planned. A third reported that they had retired earlier than they planned. And looking at this group, we found that those that had used a financial advisor were more likely than on average to have retired early. And also those who own a property or had savings of £10,000 or more were also more likely than average to have retired early. This suggests that some of those retiring early are doing so because they can afford to, although we will explore the reasons in more detail on the next slide. Interestingly, those that sought advice from a financial advisor were not only more likely than average to have retired earlier than planned, so 37% versus the 33% overall, but a significant minority retired later than planned, so 14% versus 10% of all retirees. So this may be because an advisor helped them to consider how working an extra year or two would give them a more comfortable retirement. We then went on to explore the underlying reasons for retirement. As we saw on the previous slide, some of those who retired before the age of 60 did so because they were financially ready to retire, with just under a third saying that they could afford to, 31%. A further reason among both under 60s and over 60s was that they did not want to work any longer. However, for many others who retired before 60, they told us it was due to something unexpected. Ill health was the reason for a quarter of respondents retiring, and 1 in 5 cited mental health reasons for retiring early. Retirement due to ill health was considerably higher in those who retired under the age of 60 than those who retired aged 60 or above, at 25% versus just over 1 in 10 or 11%. Similarly, those citing reduction of stress or mental health reasons for retiring was higher for those retiring under the age of 60 compared to those retiring later. Other factors contributing to retirement before the age of 60 were redundancy or job loss and becoming a carer for a relative. Looking at the reasons for some additional consumer groups, we found that those with higher levels of savings, the most common reasons for retiring were that they could afford to or that they didn't want to work anymore. But for renters, those on lower incomes and women, reaching state retirement age was the top reason for retiring. Overall, those retiring after the age of 60, 39% said it was reaching state retirement age that triggered them leaving work. The number of retirees citing these unplanned or unexpected events means that pension savers need to be aware that they might have less time than they thought to save for retirement, as many people end up having to retire unexpectedly early. We wanted to explore what people had done in the run up to their retirement and looked at some specific retirement planning activities. We found that only half of retirees had worked out how much money they might need in retirement before they retired. This varied by gender, with almost 2/3 of male retirees looking at this versus 40% of women. It also varied by the age at which people retired. 63% of those who retired under the age of 60 had worked out the money they might need, versus 46% of those who retired aged 60 or above. Around 4 in 10 had researched the retirement income options in advance of retirement. Again, we saw a gender divide, with 53% of men versus 33% of women looking at this. Overall, only just over a third, or 36%, had engaged a financial advisor about retirement. Looking at those who retired before the age of 60, this rises to 43%, compared with 33% of those who retired aged 60 or over. Looking again at mass affluent consumers, we found that they were more likely to have done all of these activities, with 74% working out how much money they might need in retirement, 62% researching their retirement income options, and 52% speaking to a financial advisor before they retired. It is encouraging to see that some people are engaging with these activities in the run up to retirement. But exploring further with those that did engage with retirement planning, we found that the majority had not done so until they were in their 50s or 60s. Those taking action before the age of 50 was relatively low, with a third of those who had looked at their retirement savings doing so before the age of 50, and just over a quarter who had looked at how much money they might need in retirement before the age of 50. Whilst taking any action is positive, the fact that they left this until their 50s or 60s may leave little time to make changes at this point if their plans are not on track. We will now share some of the data that we have collected within the Wealth and Wellbeing Research Programme that provides background on the current consumer context to pensions and retirement planning. At the time of our research, we found that a third of retirees would describe their financial situation as struggling. And when we asked them about their regular essential monthly outgoings, such as mortgage or rent, food, utility bills, or council tax, retirees told us that on average they were spending £914 a month. Considering the current level of state pension, this may be leaving those with low pension savings very stretched. It also shows that a state pension alone, there may be little spare money for things such as holidays, days out, or home improvements. Roughly a third of the retirees we surveyed said that they rely on the state pension alone to fund their retirement. Women are more likely than men to describe their financial situation as struggling, so 34% of retired women versus 25% of retired men, likely due to the on average lower pension savings. We also found in our later June research that 29% of retirees had helped family or friends financially in the past 6 months, and over 1 in 10 of them had dipped into their pensions to do so. Whilst many retirees are keen to help their children and grandchildren, it is important that they don't use too much of their retirement savings to do this, or they may risk their own financial security. The lack of pension saving also means that some retirees are using the value of their homes to help fund their retirement. 9% of retirees told us that they had downsized their property to help fund retirement, and a further 7% are considering it. Unlocking some of the capital tied up in their property via a lifetime mortgage is also being utilised by some, with 5% doing this to help fund their retirement and a further 3% considering it. Whilst the majority of retired homeowners have paid off their mortgage debt by the time they reached retirement, it was interesting to see that 1 in 10 retirees still had mortgage debt when they retired, and the average amount outstanding was around £38,000. Of those in this position, almost 2/3, or 63%, had used their pension or lump sum to pay off their mortgage debt. This can be a sensible action to take, but will have reduced their retirement income, which may lead to looking at additional ways to fund their retirement. The 20% of retirees who are renting at the point of retirement could also be feeling the extra strain on their retirement finances, especially at times like now when rental costs are increasing. This prompted us to look at how many existing mortgage holders might be in the position of having mortgage debt at the age of 65. We found a much larger 32% thinking they will be 65 or older before paying off their mortgage, with the majority expecting to be between 50 and 64 when they become mortgage free. This means the numbers reaching retirement age with mortgage debt may increase considerably over the next few years. The current workforce is facing particular financial strain, and we found that more than 1 in 10 employees told us they had opted out of their workplace pension scheme. 6% simply said they didn't want to pay into the pension, but 7% feel they can't afford to at the moment. This rises to 8% of the 18 to 34-year-olds who have opted out on the basis that they can't afford to pay in at this time. In addition to this, we see a third of the UK working population saving less than before, and a quarter of them having to use savings to cope with the current cost of living. All of these factors pose a risk to future financial security of the current workforce and place constraints on their ability to save for retirement. We will now share the reflections of current retirees on what they wish they had done differently if they could go back in time. The most common theme was saving more in advance of retirement, with 44% stating this, followed by starting to save for their retirement earlier in their lives. 12% of people also wish they'd spoken to a financial advisor pre-retirement. Here there was less difference by gender than in some of the other questions we'd asked. Men and women felt similarly about the need to save more and to start saving earlier. There was a variation in their views on whether they wished they had spoken to a financial advisor in advance of retiring. 15% of men felt this way versus just 8% of women. This is in line with the difference we saw in how many men and women had actually sought advice in the run-up to retirement. The other area where we saw a difference is whether people had retired pre or post the age of 60. Those who retired earlier tended to have less regrets. And as we demonstrated earlier, for some, early retirement was a result of saving and planning for that outcome. Among those retiring early, only 38% wished they'd saved more into their pension versus 48% of those who retired after the age of 60. And 32% wished they'd started planning for their retirement earlier versus 41% who retired at the age of 60 or later. It appears that those who save more not only get to retire earlier, but have fewer regrets. We also asked an open question, which was, what one piece of advice would you give your younger self regarding planning and saving for retirement? And you can see here some of the verbatim quotes that we got back from our respondents. The advice most given was to save as much as possible for retirement. Join your company pension as soon as possible and put in as much as you can. Make sure you have a pension in your own right. The second most common response was to start paying into a pension as early as possible. Start as early as possible, even with the smallest contribution. Start paying into a personal pension plan in your 30s. Other advice included planning and researching as much as possible, getting financial advice, and not retiring too late. Get advice and take action as early as possible. Retire as early as you can afford to. Plan early enough and you'll be able to secure your future. So a quick recap on the key findings of our research. Men are more likely to be able to afford to retire before they are 60 due to higher pension savings. And seeking advice can help people achieve earlier retirement, but it can also help make the decision to work a bit longer to achieve a more comfortable retirement. Some retired early because they could afford to, but others retired early due to something unexpected, such as ill health, mental health, redundancy, or to care for a relative. Pension savers need to be aware that they might have less time than they thought to save for retirement, as many people ended up having to retire unexpectedly early. Not enough thought and planning is happening before retirement, with only half of retirees working out how much money they might need in retirement before they retired. And many of those that did work out how much they need didn't do this until near retirement, which doesn't leave much time to make changes if at this point they realise their plans aren't quite on track. This lack of planning and saving, plus the rising cost of living, has meant that nearly a third of retirees are currently financially struggling. The overarching theme in our results is that retirees are aware that they often haven't saved enough ahead of retirement, and if they could do it all again, they would have started earlier and saved more. The takeout from this is, how can we use these insights to help motivate younger people to better plan and save for their retirement, particularly in this challenging economic environment? Are there ways to help them understand that it can be worth saving more earlier on in case retirement happens earlier than planned due to something unexpected? Thank you for listening.
Hey, thank you so much for that. Comprehensive deep dive into all this and quite a lot to unpack there. But I'll hand straight over, if I may, to Steve for the first comments.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you to Kate and LV for sharing that data. I think it's worth registering that this looks like good quality data, and you can't take that for read. I think we've all probably seen financial services companies other than LV, do a quick and dirty survey for a headline and move on. And I think it's really good, to see a survey done repeatedly, quarter by quarter by quarter, giving a time series. So that's very helpful. And to see it tested against official data sources. And I think those slides that Kate showed that show a really good match with official figures on savings rates and that kind of thing are actually very reassuring. So I think it's very much to LV's credit that they've done that so thoroughly. So thank you for that. I think a few thoughts prompted by what Kate had to say, because this word retirement uh, conveys certain mental pictures, the deck chair and the sun lounger and the cocktails and so on. And actually, retirement is being used in a very, very broad sense in this research. So it's including, yes, the well financially advised person with a big fat company pension who retires at 58 and does whatever people in that situation do. I speak as someone who's 58, but not retired. But on the other hand, there's a whole bunch of people who, as Kate said, are quotes retired in the sense that they're not going to go back to work again, but very much didn't plan it. And I think that raises some quite important issues. So ill health being an obvious one and a very topical one, with DWP very focused at the moment on economic inactivity in the over 50s, people dropping out of the labour market, which is often devastating for them financially as well as bad news for the economy. And it does raise some quite serious questions, I think, about the modelers that we give people to use. If you go on a money and pension service modeler or a financial service company modeler, it will say, what age do you want to retire? And people presumably mostly put 65 or a state pension 80 type number in there, and they may tell you how much you need to save. But we know, and this data confirms, that millions of people never get to that age. And so, are we, in a sense, without, if we don't flag that very, very clearly in these modelers, fine, you want to get to that age, but actually, we'll give you another question, which is, what if you couldn't work up to that age? What if your health gave out 5 years before? How much would you need to save then? And that might be a very different number. Now, obviously, all of these numbers can be quite scaring and off-putting. You have to think how you present it. But I think there is a risk if we tell everybody they can just chug along at a certain figure, and then things go wrong 5, 7, 10 years out, then they've got real problems. And we probably need to alert people to that more, because it does have a huge impact on their quality of living in retirement. So I think this whole health issue, and I know that Aaron and Vivian will talk a bit more about the health aspects of this, so I won't dwell any further on that. But I think a second thing, which again Kate touched on, is the role of whether you've got a mortgage or you're a renter in retirement. And I think, again, if you think about, for example, the Pensions and Lifetime Saving Association, PLSA's living standards, which have had fantastic take up, they assume essentially you've paid off all your housing costs in retirement. If you haven't, if you've got to pay a rent out of retirement, then broadly speaking, you need another £250,000 or more, ballpark figure, on top of the big scary pot of money figures that we already talk about to fund a retirement. And again, I think in these modelers, very often there is just that assumption that you've got a mortgage, you've paid it off, and you've just got to fund ordinary living costs in retirement. So I think there's a big challenge for official modelers, for financial services institution modelers, for advisors, about how we factor housing costs in retirement in. And I thought it's quite interesting, the statistic about using lump sums for, in some cases, paying off, clearing mortgage debt. And that's kind of fine. But if your tax-free lump sum out of your DC pot is there to clear your mortgage, then you've got even less DC saving. So it's not just renters, it's people with outstanding mortgages. And if you think about the stats that are coming out now, the typical first-time buyer takes out a mortgage of more than 30 years. And we know that first time buyers are increasingly likely to be in their 30s and so on. So you add 30 something to a 30 odd year mortgage and you're getting pretty close to state pension age, even if you don't extend the mortgage later on because of pressures. So this whole issue about, you think you've got enough DC pot, but then you use a quarter of it to clear your mortgage balance, is something we're going to have to think about a lot more. I was struck by the statistic which was included in the survey about downsizing. It's one of those ones where people say things like, "Oh, my house is my pension." Not investing in rental property, second properties, property investment, not that, but people often talk about their family home as their pension. And of course, that's very often not the case, even if they think it will be, and even if they plan for it to be. And that's partly because having invested in, lived in, established yourself in a family home, probably done it up over the years, the last thing you want to do at the point where you've got more time is to leave it. That's the time when you want to make the most of the family home. So people, for that reason, don't tend to trade down. They don't tend to trade down because guess what? The family home is where their friends are. It's where perhaps their children or grandchildren are. They've got their local networks. So again, trading down there is a challenge. And actually, trading down to quotes retirement properties is very expensive. There aren't that many around. They cost a lot of money. By the time you've traded down, paid all the legal stamp duty and all the rest of it, costs associated with trading down, you very often have not got a pot of money that's anything like what you need to support a retirement. So I was intrigued that even as many as 9% of people said they'd funded their retirement through downsizing. And I guess slight question as to what they meant by that. Some people perhaps did move house and maybe moved somewhere smaller, but I suspect there aren't going to be many times that actually funded a retirement. And it's important to think that we don't convey that somehow that's a decent retirement strategy, because even if you think it will be, it probably won't be when you get there. Just a couple of other quick thoughts. I like the question about, what would the current you say to the previous you? What would you have wished you'd known? Funnily enough, I think that some of those bits of advice are possibly bad advice, however. And it comes back to this business about renting and financial priorities amongst the young, which I think is something we're going to discuss. But, my kids are in their 20s. They're both, neither of them own a home at the moment. I'm pleased they've been automatically enrolled. I'm pleased they haven't opted out. I'm pleased they've got an employer contribution into a pension. That's all great. But if their career progresses and they get a pay rise, could I, in all conscience, say to them, put that money in a pension rather than put that money in a lifetime ISA, get a government top up, get a deposit, get a house? Because the best retirement planning of all is not to have to fund a rent in retirement. And so I think we have to be quite nuanced about all of this. It's tempting to say, as pensions people, cut me open and like a stick of rock, it says pensions all the way through. I mean, I even have, I love pensions on the mug I'm sitting holding, and yet I, as someone who really believes in pensions, I'm not convinced that it's definitely the right thing for young people beyond auto enrollment to spend discretionary savings on a pension if the alternative is potentially renting for longer and all of that. So and given that we often try and put out generic messages to people, I think for young people particularly, we have to be quite careful. And to be fair, many young people have just not got much discretionary cash anyway. So messaging that says to 28-year-olds, you really need to save more for when you are 70 or whatever their pension age will be by then, it's going to bounce off them anyway. So I think you just have to think, we have to think quite carefully about the language that we use and the assumptions we make. Then I suppose just a final thought about financial advice. It's a funny thing. I've spoken over the years to lots of financial advisors, and generally, those who have used financial advice on the whole are very satisfied with it. They've understood the value of it. They've seen how it's more than just, picking the right shares to invest in or whatever it is, how it's covering things like, health and care costs, about inheritance, about family and intergenerational finances, about your spouse as well as yourself, pensions, investments, tax, all of that. And about those things that constantly change. Every budget, something changes in that space. So financial advice can be really helpful, but people don't know what they don't know. There are lots of people who could benefit, perhaps in that mass affluent group that Kate described, who've got enough money to have choices, but don't realize what advantage advice can give them. And I think one of the challenges is to overcome that, getting them over the doorstep, the virtual doorstep or the real doorstep, to perhaps experience financial advice, see the value of it, and then choose to continue with it. And I think if we just say to people, you should take financial advice, they'll say, well, I haven't got £1,000 or whatever it is they think they'll have to pay up front for it. And because you can't do pensions advice on a sort of contingent, because a lot of financial advice, the structure of the product, in the old days, you'd be able to get free advice and the advisor was getting commission on the sale. Well, that wasn't great either. But the loss of commission, the retail distribution review, has meant that people now perceive paying for pensions advice in particular as being very expensive. And if you don't have much to spare to begin with, then you're probably not going to do it. So I think mechanisms to enable people to experience advice, perhaps vouchers or whatever it is, could enable them to see it was worth doing, and then they'd be more likely to spend some money out of their pension saving directly to pay for advice. So, Paul, just a few thoughts there from me off the back of the survey, but looking forward to hearing what Aaron and Vivian have got to say and to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Steve. Great. Aaron, may we come to you now, please?
Great. Sorry about that. It took a second to find the unmute button. Thank you so much for having me on this webinar. I think, fantastic resource of data here, so much that, we can unpick and unpack. But I'd like to focus most mainly on the health point that was made in this presentation slides, because I think that's a really important area to look at, considering the topic on, how do we get people to work for longer and be in a better position in retirement. So the fact that health is, the top 3 most commonly cited reasons for retiring early, I think is really important. And of course, we see that number go down for those aged over the age of 60, but it's still one of the leading reasons for retiring. I think this just really drives home that point that health is key to really enabling people to work for longer. We did a bit of research a couple of years back looking at the G20, and we found that people who report being in good health rather than poor health are 4 times more likely to be in work between the ages of 50 and 65, and 10 times more likely to be in work between the ages of 65 and 74. So good health can have a lasting impact on people's ability to remain in work should they want to, and this is particularly has a bigger impact as we age. This year we launched our Healthy Aging and Prevention Index, which ranks 121 countries on 6 healthy aging metrics, and one of the ones that we look at is average work span, and we do that by looking at the number of average years on average, a person will spend in work between the ages of 15 and 65. And in the UK, people work for about 31 and a half years of their life. And to put it into context, in the global rank, they rank 47 out of the 121 countries. So there's certainly a lot that can be done to improve those numbers, and health plays an important role in that. I think it's also worthwhile mentioning the role of, or the context in the UK with health inequalities being a huge driver of lower, poor outcomes in terms of income, in terms of work as well. There's a 19-year gap in healthy life expectancy between the least and most deprived areas. And we know that those from poor income groups are more likely at risk of retiring early due to ill health. A bit of additional research that we did on this was that we found that older workers from the unhealthiest areas are 60% more likely to be out of work than those from the healthiest areas. In places where a higher proportion of older people are in poor health, fewer people of all ages are in paid work. So this goes to show that the issue around health is not just an individual issue. It affects the entire economy, community, and across ages as well. So investing in health is good for individuals, but also more widely for society. And when we actually look at, why are people unhealthy? Is there anything we can do about that? Well, 40% of ill health is actually due to or linked to preventable factors, things like smoking, nutrition, lack of physical activity, alcohol, and drug use. So there's a lot that can be done to actually reduce this burden. When we talk about the benefits of investing in preventative health, we're not talking about huge sums of money here. So even just a 0.1% increase in investment in preventative health can unlock 9% increase in annual spending by people over the age of 60, and an additional 10 hours of volunteering and caring. One of the key recommendations that we've been pushing for as part of our global prevention program of work is that all countries should be spending at least 6% of their health budgets on prevention. And once that is achieved, continue to align that prevention spending to the preventable disease burden within the country. So, the ideal situation is that as you start to invest more in prevention, actually the need to support people to remain healthy diminishes as people are generally healthier overall. Also looking at, what are the existing policies that we could be leveraging here? So the leveling up infrastructure that we currently have, is there a role there where, that funding pot could actually be used to help create jobs or suitable jobs for older workers, particularly in the unhealthiest local authorities? So I just wanted to end with a few sort of final points around what the role of employers could be in supporting health. Because I think there is an opportunity here that employers can have, they can play a role. And actually, previous research, not from the ILC, but more widely, has suggested that people generally want their employers to play a role in their well-being and actually feel that they have a duty to do so. When we consider that, a third of UK employees report having a long-term health condition, and 1 in 4 have at least 2 health conditions, we're talking about huge proportion of the working population. Almost half of people in poor health who are in work report that their health condition is actually also affecting their work. We've seen, during the pandemic, lots of examples of employers sort of taking on that role to improve vaccine uptake. Leading employers, including Asda, IKEA, Santander, all played a role to encourage their staff to get the COVID vaccine. So how can we take those types of examples and case studies and use it as sort of a way forward to improve health? And it can be around, improving life course immunization for routine adult immunization. It can include wider programs around cardiovascular screening, cancer screening, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, on-site provision. It can be giving flexibility to workers to take paid time off during their work day to visit their GP. It could also be educational campaigns. It could also be about how do you navigate the NHS? How can you actually seek help? So there's lots of different things that that employers can do, all the way from sort of nudges to these wider educational campaigns. And I think also there is a point that's worthwhile looking at, which is around what is the role of government more widely in supporting employers to do this, because often when we see these examples, it's from large-scale employers. Smaller businesses have a harder time implementing such interventions. So how can the government support smaller businesses to support their own employees? How can they actually demonstrate or show to them what interventions are going to have the biggest outcomes in health? And so there's certainly something there that needs to be unteased, but also can help this sort of intervention be widespread across the economy. So lots of different things here, and I'd love to kind of explore some of these later on during the Q&A. But thank you so much for listening, and we'll speak during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. That's fantastic. And Vivian, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I should say I'm unfortunately having some internet connection problems today, so hopefully it will sort of hold up for the next 5 or 10 minutes or so. But yeah, I wanted to say thank you, Kit, for a very interesting presentation, and as Steve mentioned, a really interesting and useful data set that you're compiling. I think that your findings really speak to what's becoming a growing concern, which is about how well prepared people are for retirement. And this is something that's going to become increasingly important in sort of coming years and decades as we gradually move away from defined benefit towards defined contribution schemes. We've got the introduction of pension freedoms as well, and all of this sort of combining to, I think, put a greater emphasis on individual responsibility when it comes to planning your retirement. And then there is the associated, I think, but also very important shift of risk away from employers and organizations towards individuals bearing a greater proportion of risks when it comes to retirement planning and saving. Now, as I think the slides highlighted, there is quite a lot of evidence showing that people aren't overall well prepared for retirement. So I think in your slides, 44% of people said they'd wished they'd saved more money. Close to 40% said they wished they'd started saving sooner. And then I think it was around 30% who were currently struggling, or found their current financial situation was struggling. And that, of course, is obviously linked to current cost of living crisis. But I think that also highlights one of the very sort of the key difficult elements of planning for retirement, which is the uncertainty that we face. You know, and you're sort of planning over a long horizon, and it's very difficult to, say difficult, it's impossible to know in advance exactly what's going to happen. And that element of uncertainty, I think, is an important one to keep in mind. There's some research that ILC did a couple of years ago looking at sort of retirement income prospects among Gen Xers, so people born between sort of mid-60s and the 1980s. And that research suggests that around, or just under 1/3 of people were not saving enough to sustain an adequate income in retirement. And as we might expect, this problem is more pronounced with particular groups of people. So people who are renting and renting for longer, people self-employed, but also people with developed sort of, certain health conditions, people with caring responsibilities, and of course people on low incomes. So I guess the key question really, which is the one you highlighted at the end of the slides, is well, what can we do to change things? So what can we do to support particularly younger people in planning their retirement? And I think here, obviously, the introduction of auto-enrollment has been a big success. I think as of June this year, there were just under 11 million people automatically enrolled in their pensions. I think ever since the introduction of auto-enrollment, the opt-out option was a concern. But I think studies have found that opt-out rates have remained roughly stable at around 1 in 10. Now, obviously, these do increase at times of greater uncertainty. I think the fact that employers are required to re-enroll eligible employees every 3 years, I think is helping to keep those opt-out rates, prevent them from increasing too much. So with automatic enrollment, it's, you know, the good thing is that more people are saving, but of course they're not, or the evidence suggests that they're not really saving enough. And the problem there, as I think most people are aware, is that the default contribution rates are just not enough for most people. And I think this was something that's highlighted in your slides as well, where 33% of people are paying the default contribution rate. What I thought was quite interesting here.
I think we may have lost Vivian, unfortunately. Let's just give her a second to come back. Yes, Vivian, you're back with us.
Sorry, yes, I started to see everyone was looking very still, and I thought, oh, I don't know if what I'm saying is that interesting. I don't know, what point did I cut out? So
it was only a couple of seconds.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so what I was going to say, I thought one thing that was quite interesting on the slides was that around 36% of people would actually like to save more, but a big proportion of those, so 19%, weren't able to increase their contribution rates. And I think this is something that previous ILC research has also found. So from this study that we did looking into the retirement income prospects of Generation X people, we found that over half of people surveyed wanted or would like to save more for their retirement, but were unable to do so. So I think going back to that question of like, what can we do? What should we do? I think we really can't ignore the very real financial barriers that affect some people when it comes to saving for their retirement. And as Steve mentioned earlier, often it comes to making these difficult decisions. So if you are fortunate enough to have a bit of extra money, you know, should you be putting it towards your pension? Are you better off using it to put towards a deposit or pay down your mortgage? But having said that, I think it's also useful to explore other reasons or other barriers that are preventing people from saving. And the evidence here suggests that low motivation is a problem, but also lack of information has been found to be an important barrier. So I think when it comes to that question of what can or what should we be doing, I think it's essentially about finding ways to encourage people who are able to save more for their retirement, but while also finding ways to support people who aren't able to save more. So whether that's by supporting lower incomes or supporting people to work for longer, so particularly people with health conditions, as Aaron has mentioned, or people with caring responsibilities. But thinking about things that I think we could do, and I think the government is to some extent already considering doing to encourage people to save more. I think one obvious policy here is introducing some form of auto-escalation mechanism sorry, into the sort of auto-enrollment pensions, where employee contributions would rise in line with increases in pay, for example, promotions. Now, obviously, you'd want to keep or retain the opt-out mechanism, but I think having auto-escalation would help nudge some of these saving rates upwards. But I think also increasing access to other savings vehicles, in particular sidecar savings vehicles, which are tied to pensions, but which give people this pot of money that they can access in an emergency, is also a useful avenue to consider. I think on the information side, we could probably do more to formalize simple rules of thumb to give people an idea, and not wanting to ignore the very important point that Steve made about this being a very sort of nuanced, people are different, we have different needs, our needs vary over the course of our lives, of course. But I think having some sort of simple rules of thumb so people have an idea of, what is the sort of benchmark that I should be aiming for at different points in my life for saving. And I think employers can also play an important role here. So, for example, through midlife MOTs that some employers already offer, maybe extending those to individuals in younger age brackets. So giving people an opportunity to start, or encouraging people rather, to start thinking about their retirement planning and to start having those conversations, I think is a very useful way to go. But yeah, so just like to, I guess, sort of finish, I mean, there are sort of other policies, and I'm sure we'll have the opportunity to discuss these during the Q&A session. But I think on the retirement planning side, it really is about encouraging people who can to save more, but also trying to support those who can't, for various reasons, save more during their working lives. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Vivian, and thank you to Steve, Aaron and Vivian for their reflections back on that. Thank you to those who put the questions in the Q&A function. That's still open if you want to add more questions in there. But I think I'd like to start the Q&A session with some things that have come through. Sharon Tyne has put a very interesting message in the chat, in the Q&A function, that talks about 75,000 NHS staff pulling out of the scheme, their pension scheme in the NHS, because of cost of living crisis. And there were, I think 25 of those were actually under 30. And Kate, from your data, you said that 8% of 18 to 34-year-olds had opted out of their own pensions because of that, because of the cost of living. So I think opening this up would be, all right, well, how do we engage with people at the earliest point in order to get them to appreciate, to save more, or to actually start planning? And I think my question to the panel is, do we inform, do we nudge, do we compel? Which one do we opt for? So Steve, can I come to you first on that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Paul. I think there is a particular issue with the NHS pension scheme and DB schemes more generally, which is that paradoxically, the contribution rates are high. Everyone on this panel knows that they are extraordinarily good schemes to be a member of, and you'd kill to be a member of one if you work in the private sector. Having said that, if you're a 28-year-old nurse, you're not putting in the mandatory 5% gross of a band of qualifying earnings. You might be putting in 8% of all of your earnings, or whatever the figures are. It depends on your income. So we do ask relatively young public sector workers to put quite a lot of their money into a pension, and guess what? Money's tight, they can't afford the bills, they opt out, still in relatively modest numbers, it's worth saying. So in a way, it is worrying. I think one of the reasons is that the trade unions over the years have argued that the changes to public sector pensions have all been so bad that these are now awful pensions. And literally, I've been to a secondary school, and you go to the staff room and the walls are plastered with trade union posters saying they're doing terrible things to your teacher's pension. And by implication, you might think, well, is it worth having? I knocked on the door of a teacher during an election campaign, and she said, well, I'm going to opt out of the teacher's pension because they've made it useless. and I think the trade unions have to take, I'm slightly going off your topic here, Paul, but if the trade unions are the one group who workers in the public sector might trust, and if they're communicating that the pension, you've got to work longer, you've got to pay more in, you're going to get less out, it's all a bit rubbish. If they don't convey the value of these pensions, then we're fighting a losing battle. So I think certainly in terms of that story and DB, I think the trade unions have got a crucial role, and I'm not sure they're behaving entirely responsibly.
Thank you. And just that point about how we actually engage people, that this sort of inform, nudge, or compel. I mean, do public information campaigns?
Waste of time. Complete waste of time.
That's the informed bit out the way. What about the other
I say that because if you think about it, just before we started automatic enrolment, roughly 1 in 3 workers in the private sector was saving into a pension. We tried engagement, we tried publicity campaigns, we tried ministers going on the box and talking about, it didn't work. You had to have mass defaults. And then, we didn't engage people in auto enrollment. I used to say I went around the country stirring up inertia. We simply put 10 million or so people in, and 9 out of 10 stayed in. And, to think that works so powerfully, but what we now really need is some publicity campaigns, seems to miss the fundamental point. And I very much agree with Vivian's point. It is having got people started, some sort of auto escalation feels to me, we know it works in the States. So, for example, companies who will do a generous match, well, default people in at the generous match and let them opt down. Don't make them find out about it and opt up. So I'm sure overwhelmingly it's about defaults and nudges rather than about information and engagement.
Sure, thank you. Kate, from your data, was there any insights that you saw in either what you presented or in the other parts of the survey that would give us an insight into how we can do that engagement better?
I think it's probably a difficult one to answer from the questions that we asked people, because many of them admitted they hadn't had advice. They'd gone into their retirement without that, and I guess we have to recognise that many of them that we have spoken to were possibly on defined benefit schemes, whereas that will potentially be different for younger people. But I think we have flagged in our recent reporting around this sort of drop in younger people taking part in their sort of workplace pensions, that we're concerned about that and what it might mean for their financial security in the future, and maybe understanding that even if you can keep your contributions very low, keeping something in there will be beneficial if you keep it in there when you're young, because you've got more time for that to grow and work for you.
Thank you. Vivian, any thoughts?
Yes, I'd be inclined to agree with Steve's point here, and that I think there is a place for information, but I think when it comes to making these decisions, and particularly if you're asking a 20 or 30-year-old to put more money away for their retirement in 30, 40 years' time, current day needs are always going to seem more pressing. So I think the element of I maybe wouldn't go so far as compelling, but the great thing with automatic enrolment is that the opt-out option is there, but the majority of people don't go for it. And I think that is something that we could make better use of, really.
Thank you. Aaron?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that we called for. So I think definitely it does have a benefit. And I think the point around sort of the financial advice, we did a bit of research into this as well, and we found that actually it has the biggest impact on people from less affluent groups. They're saving more, they have greater assets. So, there's certainly a benefit of that. Also quite interesting with that point, I know it's slightly different to what we're talking about, but from some of the work that we did on that topic, we also found that those who are in particularly difficult financial situations, and most often women as well, find or believe that financial advice won't benefit them at all, because their financial situations can be quite difficult or quite extreme, that actually there isn't any help there. So I think this sort of kind of making those financial decisions easier for people through auto escalation, I think is a really good way of kind of overcoming these kinds of issues that people may have.
Thank you. Thanks. There are still the option to put more Q&A in the Q&A function if you wish, but I'd like to sort of turn the discussion, if I can now, to the role of homes and housing, because there's several comments in the Q&A session. I think we've touched on it in the discussions. The role of the home as Steve touched on this as a pension itself. The role of renters, I think, is on that figure there. Someone's highlighted it as well. The figure of $250,000 extra needed if you're a renter to have the same level of an adequate retirement as if you were owning your own home. So I think there's something we'd like to sort of delve into a bit with that as well. Vivian, any thoughts you've got on the use of the home in retirement? I mean, we also might comment on the sort of equity release products as well. I know lifetime mortgages were mentioned in Kate's presentation, but just really want to drill down into that. What's the role of the home in retirement? Steve's very much said it would be his feeling was I think, Steve, you were saying if you're a younger person, and it would be better for you to be saving for a deposit on a home rather than putting that additional money into a pension. Well, what's the implications for that later on? And does the home then become that pension asset in whatever form? So Vivian, can I turn to you first?
Yes, I think it's an interesting question, but a very challenging one, because I think it's a classic example of where what on paper might seem like a sensible option is unlikely to work in practice. And I think in partly for some of the reasons that Steve mentioned, that people, our home, it is an asset, but it is also our house is an asset, but it's also our home. And people grow attached to it for any number of reasons. And I guess on the one extreme, you might have people living in living circumstances, particularly which are not suited to their needs later in life, and maybe moving into a smaller property or a more accessible property would be a good idea. But equally, there are people for who staying in the home for longer, or in the home that they've grown up in or lived most of their life in, is going to be better for their health. So I think it is. I don't unfortunately have the answer. I think it is challenging because I don't think it's a solution that would work for the majority of people, really. And yeah, well, I think that on paper, yes, it makes sense. I think there are a lot of sort of practical barriers that would mean that even if people planned with that in mind, when it came to that point in their lives, they'd be unlikely to want to sell their home or release the equity that they've got in it. I mean, having said that, I think there is perhaps scope for within the development of certain equity release products, that allow people to actually carry on living in their home for longer, but accessing some of the equity they have in it. I think that would probably be more likely to work as a solution than actually sort of expecting people to downsize later in life.
Okay, thank you. Kate, just coming back to you and some of the data again, the use of the home. Any comments from you on how it was viewed, what it might be used for?
It's interesting, actually. It's something we will be exploring more in our next report. So unfortunately can't share all the data with you now, but we've gone into a bit more detail around people's views on, lifetime mortgages and using equity release a bit beyond. Obviously, we still saw relatively small numbers had actually done that or were considering doing that amongst existing retirees, but we've widened the base and sort of spoken to all ages of consumers and see how they feel about that. So unfortunately I can't add a lot more today, but it will be something that will be coming out in our report in sort of November time, end of November.
So those are the questions that you've asked in this round of the survey that will then be coming out.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, when they come out, we'll make sure that we share them. Thank you for that. Steve, you touched on the role of housing in your reflections. Could drill down a bit more into that for us, if you could.
Yes, I mean, something I didn't focus on is the regional differences. I mean, if you think of average house prices, for example, in the north of England, the difference between the house that you're in at the point of retirement and then moving downsize to still a pretty decent house just isn't going to give you the absolute cash amount you need to fund a retirement. I mean, the gap just isn't enough, because potentially if you literally your home is your pension and you haven't saved for a pension, you potentially need to clear a couple of £100,000 or more from the transaction. If the average house price in north of England is probably of that order, you you'd have nothing left, you know. So I think, you know, I can see why in perhaps the southeast of England there's more of a possibility. And certainly equity release is a kind of halfway house, literally, I suppose, you know, because it enables you to stay where you are, but access some of the equity. And clearly, as DB pensions die and DC pensions don't come through at an adequate level, people will be kind of, you know, cash, you know, income poor, but wealth house rich, as it were. So affordable equity release, I think, is part of the mix. Equity release interest rates have started to look a bit scary again. I mean, you know, there was a time when the equity release mortgage rates had come down a heck of a lot. They are now looking quite high. And if you are literally not going to pay anything off, you know, you're not going to service even the interest on the money that you're borrowing, then you can essentially, on average, wave goodbye to pretty much any of the equity if you live for an average length of time. So there are issues about how we regulate equity release, and if it was regulated in a slightly more relaxed way, because in a sense, one of the reasons the interest rates are high is that the providers have to give a no negative equity guarantee, which is a good thing. You know, you don't want people to die and then their heirs actually have a bill to pay. But that means that the providers of equity relief mortgages are having to set a lot of money aside, possibly for decades hence, to honour the no negative equity guarantee. And the solvency rules mean that's a very expensive thing to do. So in a funny sort of way, it's a bit esoteric, but if we regulated the solvency of equity release providers in a slightly more generous way, interest rates could come down and the product might be more successful. The only other thing I'd say is people look at the value of their home and think, oh, I live in a £250,000 house, I can release up to 250,000. On average, if at retirement, you'd be lucky to borrow a third. You know, and those who are immersed in this kind of know that. But if you've never really looked at it, you might not realize that for the reason I just gave, they're quite reluctant to lend you more than about a third of the value of the house. So again, that's going to limit quite how much you can do via the equity release route.
Cool. Thank you, Steve. And Aaron, can we pick up the issue of housing with you, because we know the role that housing plays in healthy aging and health. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot to be said around the design of homes and making them lifelong homes so that, you know, people as they age have a place that fits their needs, and, you know, the need to downsize is less of something that people have to consider. So I think there's certainly a lot that needs to be done with in terms of, you know, retrofitting houses, but we know that there's a lot of issues with that, and a lot of the, you know, the policy calls have been very similar over a very long time around this, and not a lot has changed. And especially when we are thinking about people buying their own homes at a later age and a later stage in their life, I think that becomes more important, because we then will see people, you know, living in their homes for longer and for when they're older. But I think that's a huge topic to explore. But I think there's certainly something there that, you know, that certainly plays a role in terms of, you know, making sure that people have a place to live, and a place that, you know, fits their needs and their health needs especially.
Thank you. And interesting, George McGuinness has just put something in the Q&A for us. There's a Telegraph Online today has got a feature about the downsizing penalty trapping millions of pensioners in their own home. So this picks up some of those comments by Damien Green about tax incentives to downsize, and maybe those would be a way of unfreeing the downsizing issue. So I'd like to move on, if I can, to the whole idea of when people are thinking about their retirement planning, what they're actually going to be using it for. I mean, we've sort of touched on the home as being the pension, but I think one of the questions that was in the Q&A very much asked about the whole idea of care and how we fund care in our retirement. And is that something that people think about when they are taking their pensions planning advice? Aaron, on the topic of people as they age, when they are likely to become ill and not be able to work, and that sort of health in later life issue, can you just give us something on that, on how, you know, how that might be funded, depending on where they are in terms of their state pension age, or their pension age in when they take other parts of their pensions, and that sort of the difference between when people become ill and when they die, and funding that gap?
So I think, so one thing I would say is, you know, we've been talking about how, and, you know, the research and data that Kate had shared around people wanting to be in a better place at a younger age, thinking about their retirement and saving for their retirement. I mean, if that's something that people are already, worried that they didn't do enough of, thinking about care costs is just not on the radar for people. They don't think about this. They don't consider this in their financial plan. I think part of that is because, it's not the most, it's not the nicest topic to think about, but also it's very difficult to plan for something that you just don't know you'll have. I mean, care costs can range significantly depending on the health condition. So it's really difficult to plan for something that seems, at least for individuals, may seem very unlikely, although we know the wider stats is that people are getting unhealthier, they're getting unhealthier earlier. So it is something that they will have to certainly consider. But I think from an individual standpoint, I mean, this is not something that people do consider. And I think it's really hard to think about that because it can sort of impede on any other financial, I guess, goals that they may have for themselves. So I think it's really, really difficult to consider these sorts of things. And there isn't a solution at the moment for care and how to fund that. It's such a big issue. And I think, certainly it can't be something that individuals have to bear or consider on themselves. They need government direction here.
Thank you, Aaron. Vivian.
Yeah, so I'd absolutely agree with that. I think given the massive uncertainty involved and the huge variability in potential costs that individuals can face, I think there's a definite role for government here by providing some form of sort of effectively social insurance against future care costs. And I guess sort of just building on Aaron's earlier points about investing in prevention, I think that's also where again, there's a sort of a role for government, whether directly or through sort of encouraging employers and individuals to basically do what we can to support our health for as long as possible, and insofar as possible, minimize the need for care later in life. But of course, bearing in mind that you can do everything right, and that's no guarantee that you won't face significant care costs later in life. So,
thank you. Kate, from the survey and the use of the money when people were retiring, was there anything you could pull out from that?
Not specifically. It's actually interesting to be raised as an area. It's not something we've explored in great detail actually within this survey yet, but potentially perhaps it is something that would be interesting to find out how front of mind it is for people either that have gone through that phase or perhaps approaching that age group. So it's something I've noted down to take away and have a think about.
Thank you. And Steve, just coming to you in terms of the use of that money and the planning for things like care, anything from you on that?
Yes, I mean, when Sir Andrew Dilnot did his big report for the government shockingly, about 10 years ago, slightly more, he used this phrase catastrophic care costs. Some of us will have zero care costs, literally be, run over by a bus, as it were. Some of us will have quite modest care costs later in life for a short period of time, but a small number of us will have six-figure care costs because we spend years in a care home with dementia and are cared for. You cannot save for that. I mean, what's the right amount to save for that completely unpredictable thing? And that's why it's disappointing that successive governments have failed to get a handle on either social insurance or some form of subsidized private insurance or whatever. So I think that's clearly a priority. I think the other thing that people probably don't quite get about social care and so on is just how rationed it is. So someone pointed out that if you look at the 2021 census, there are fewer people in residential care than there were in the 2011 census. Now, you might think, well, that's crazy. Think of the aging population over that decade. And yet, basically, some care homes have been closed for regulatory reasons and financial reasons and so on. New builds very difficult. So there's a whole bunch of people who would have been in residential care who are now having very high levels of care in their own home, or not enough care in their own home. And people who might once have got some sort of subsidized local authority care, that threshold's gone up as well. So actually, very often people are paying for care for longer and at higher levels than would ever have been the case in the past. And yet the financial system hasn't caught up with that. And we need government intervention on that. Government intervention could underpin financial products. The two aren't at war with each other. But if the when I worked at Royal London, we looked at coming up with long-term care insurance products, and one of the barriers is you've no idea what the government bit of the deal is going to be. If the government, like in Scotland, albeit rationed, suddenly said, well, personal care is going to be free, that'd be wholly different. And trying to design a functional product against that background is impossible.
Thank you. I'd like to come on now to the interesting question about long. We're inviting individuals to think long term about their own future, and apologies to Steve here as a former pensions minister, governments don't tend to look very long term. They tend to look very short term to the next press release or the next election or whatever. We do know there are governments around the country, around the world, who have, I think it's Saudi Arabia has got a minister for futures, and there are certainly other governments where they are actually taking they have a minister for longevity. I think in Wales they've got something in Wales on that. I heard. So I think what I'd like to actually open up with the panel is: do we need the policy and product landscape to be looking far more long term? If we're asking individuals to think about their futures, we actually need to be supporting that with the culture behind it that actually comes from government and business. Steve, I'm going to come to you first on that one, as having more expertise in the policy area than anybody else.
Well, yeah, I mean, so were you referring to the Older People's Commissioner in Wales, perhaps?
So maybe, yeah.
I was sometimes people used to say we should have a minister for aging and all of that kind of thing, and I was usually quite skeptical because there is a risk that basically the Treasury controls the purse strings, and if this person is nothing to do with the Treasury, then and they're peripheral, they're ministers who are sort of pan government, almost don't have a home, don't have any punch, don't have it's very, very hard to be an effective cross-departmental minister. I think that's the first observation I'd make. In terms of seeing older people and our later lives holistically, again, you've got this departmental silo problem. So, for example, the discussion we just had about renting in retirement, it might well be the best thing we could do for the standard of living of retirees is, as one of the Q&A suggested, build more homes or something. So it might well be that housing policy might well be the best pensions policy. I used to say that DWP didn't need one employment minister and one pensions minister. It needed two employment ministers. Because if we could get the jobs market sorted with people with good lifetime jobs, and that came with pensions, probably sorted the pension bit. So in a way, I think, as you say, a lot of this is cross-departmental, which doesn't work well in the siloed nature of government, and entirely by the kind of politicians who are only interested in the next press release. I mean, there's a bit of that, obviously, I've seen, but things like 2050 targets on climate change, all right, you're not going to be in office when they're set, but there is a debate about setting these long-term targets. The impact of auto enrollment that we introduced in 2012 won't really be felt by new retirees till the 2030s or something like that. But you do get instances of people thinking long-term. Ideally, if you can build a consensus around that, so some of the things I was able to do in office, the next government didn't immediately reverse. So I think trying to build, of course, you can have legitimate debate and disagreement about pensions and tax and all those sorts of things. But if you can, as far as possible, build consensus as a politician, even, you've got a better chance of things outlasting you.
Thank you. Aaron, on the health issue and the looking long term that will feed into our retirement, what have we got on that?
Well, I think the global narrative around future-proofing population health has certainly changed over the last few years. And I think a lot of governments realize that, long-term impact it can have, particularly with, the chance that another pandemic could be on the horizon. So I think there is certainly a lot more interest in wanting to invest in good health, but obviously we need to actually see that in terms of numbers, investing more in prevention. I think that there are certainly things that can be implemented that you will see sort of immediate benefits. Some things will take longer. Of course, I didn't mention it previously, but a lot of the health issues that we were looking at was on physical health, but mental health is also something that is going to, you're going to have, I imagine, Kate, those numbers go up over generations with more and more people reporting poor mental mental health, and then also, I guess, the number of people exiting the workforce to provide care for their parents as well. So those numbers will change too. So I do think that certainly health is becoming more and more part of, being integrated into more policies. But of course, we need to see more of that. And we need to really demonstrate the economic benefits to individuals, to societies, to workplaces when it comes to investing in health.
And perhaps a question for you, but perhaps for Vivian as well. Do we know globally who are there any countries who are doing a particular amount of work on pensions reform at the moment? Is there anything we can learn from those? Aaron or Vivian on that one? Aaron first, if you've got anything. Or if you haven't, I'll go.
I was going to actually just very shamelessly plug our webinar next week, which is going to be focused on Europe and looking at ILC Europe and looking at health and work. So I'm hoping that some of the answers we'll get some of those answers next week. So stay tuned for that. I'm certainly not an expert on global pensions, but yeah, if you're interested in looking at health and work and income, definitely come to that webinar. I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who can respond to that specific question.
Thanks. Vivian, anything from you on the sort of long-term view and how we get that across to governments and policymakers?
In terms of, I guess, going back to that question about shifting or highlighting the importance of longevity, I think efforts that some countries have taken to set up sort of specific departments for longevity are useful to the extent that they are helping to highlight the importance of the issue. But I think there are other ways to do this, and I think perhaps what we need to focus on more is bringing longevity to the center of the agenda across different departments, rather than because as Stephen and Aaron have said, it's not a sort of single policy issue. It spans multiple departments. So I think the way forward is really to highlight that across, whether it's health, employment, housing, and so on.
Thank you. And Kate, anything from you on this one?
I think probably slightly out of our sort of remit with this program to think about policy, but I guess as a financial services provider, we're thinking about how our products and services can support the best outcomes for people within the context of what we're finding out from these surveys. So that's very much something we're feeding in to all the teams here around making sure they understand the consumer context.
Thank you. So we have a few minutes left. I'm just going to do a few quick adverts for ILC events that are coming up. And whilst I'm doing that, I'd like all four of our panelists, if you could just have a quick think about some last thoughts that you'd like to leave us and the debate with. So from ILC's point of view, a few adverts for our forthcoming events. Next Monday, we're hosting a discussion in Brussels on cardiovascular health disparities in Europe. And as Aaron's just highlighted, next Tuesday, we've got a webinar looking at how European countries compare to each other on preventative health measures. And again, that's using our Healthy Aging and Preventive Index. Also, I'd like to mention our Future of Aging conference on the 7th of December at the Wellcome Collection in London, where we're going to be launching our longevity white paper in partnership with Aviva. Details of the agenda and the tickets can be found on our website. So that's a few brief minutes for our panel just to give some closing thoughts. Kate, can we come to you just for a final thoughts on some of the questions, on some of the discussions?
Yeah, thank you. I thank you everyone for your questions. There's been some really interesting things for us to take forward and think about within the programme. I think the overriding thought for us was just how can we use what we found out to sort of help and support younger consumers that we also come into contact with as a business to help them have good retirement outcomes, but also just to say we are constantly looking at new topics in this area. So have a look at the Wealth and Wellbeing area on lv.com, and you'll see all of our previous reports. And as I mentioned, there's a few topics linked to this that will be covered in our next report as well, that will come out sort of late November, early December. So yeah, but just want to say thank you to everyone for a really interesting debate.
Thank you, Kate. Steve.
Yes, and I think just one just to flag one topic that we probably haven't given enough attention to, which is short-term saving. So I think obviously we talk about saving for your retirement and the importance of that, about building funds for a house and so on. But something I encounter a lot, I in my spare time do some debt advice, and you see that the margin between getting into problem debt and not, it can be £1,000 or something of liquid cash, of sidecar savings, as in the Nest example. And I think, again, as part of this nuanced message about, yes, save a lot for your retirement, but also make sure you're not a renter in retirement, but also try and make sure you've got that cash buffer that just keeps your finances under control. And I think, when we talk about saving, it can be tempting to think about long-term saving as the only good, and actually short-term saving is almost the first priority.
Thank you, Steve. Aaron.
Sure. I think I'll just, sort of again drive home that message around the role of health in supporting people to work for longer. And so I think the focus really needs to be about investing more in preventative health, and investing in strategies that's going to level up those from the poorest areas with those in the most well-off areas. So reducing health inequalities, improving investment in preventative health, because the largest burden of health is coming from preventable conditions. So there is something that we can do about it. It's not inevitable. And so this is definitely something that should be a priority, because not only will it improve people's health, but it will have a wider impact on their ability to work for longer, to spend more, to volunteer more, to care more. It has such a huge impact on the economy.
Thanks, Aaron. And Vivian, finally.
Thank you. Well, yeah, I think I'd just like to end by saying, thank you for all the sort of questions and comments. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I think it's really highlighted the sort of the complexity of the issues. You can't just look at retirement planning through a single lens. I think I'd like to go back to one of my starting points, which has to do with the data. I think to understand a lot of the problems we face in the world today and try and identify what sort of solutions are likely to work, having good data is really, really important. So I think the data that LV are collecting is very useful in that respect. And I guess, they are complex problems, as we all know, but I think there are also some, I wouldn't go as far as calling them easy wins, but there are certain policies that we know are likely to work. And one of them is sort of thinking about expanding auto-enrollment, introducing some form of auto-escalation mechanism. And I think there are policies like those that we could, sort of focus a bit more on. And I think, I'll finish on that.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you so much for that. From my point of view, I think one of the key things that came through to me is that whole big question I was interested in around the sort of inform, nudge, or compel. I think we've definitely moved to the sort of compel end of that, and I think the next thing for us to be thinking about is, well, what does that look like, and what are the auto escalation mechanisms that may sort of come in from that. So I would just like to thank our speakers this afternoon. So thank you to Kate, Steve, Aaron, and Vivian. Kate, for all the survey and the insights you've given on that, and Steve, Aaron, and Vivian for your reflections on some of those discussions. And thank you for all of those who've attended the webinar this afternoon. I'm sorry I wasn't able to ask all of the questions that were on the Q&A, but hopefully what we've done this afternoon will encourage you to maybe contact us and we can explore those questions a little more. But thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for attending, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Thank you very much.